Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship, New Jersey Museum and Memorial, and today we're going to talk about what we walk on. There are 4 main surfaces that you'll see on the ship that you walk on: wood, linoleum tile, rubber, and steel. Why do we use these things? What are they for? We're going to cover all that over the next hour and a half. As built during World War II, Battleship New Jersey had mostly a bare metal deck. This was pretty common for the war-built ships. It was just more expedient to send them out with the metal decks. It was less material to burn, and it was easier to repair damage. The ship has always had a teak wood deck on the main deck and up through several levels of the superstructure. The teak is there for 2 main reasons. 1, it gives you traction, and 2, it offers insulation. We're down on second deck right now. This is where many of the office and berthing spaces are, and directly above us is the steel main deck. The ship was designed to operate in the South Pacific with the sun overhead. That sun would just cook the steel deck and make these spaces down below much hotter. By the 1980s, air conditioning was common throughout the ship, but it was not in World War II when she was built. And so the teak wood deck, keeping the sun off, was the main insulator to keep the ship from getting too hot on the inside. Many parts of the ship have had insulation added since then, primarily fiberglass insulation in spaces like this. It's not installed in the overheads. The teak wood deck provides all the insulation there.
If you are interested in owning a piece of teak from Battleship New Jersey's wood decks, while we rip it up and replace it with new stuff, we save everything that we've torn out. You can buy individual pieces of this, which are priced based on their size, in our online store. And also check eBay for large sections that we're auctioning off. In some cases, multiple boards come up in one chunk. And we sell those so that you can make them into tables, bar tops, whatever.
So modern Navy ships don't tend to use tile. They also don't use teak anymore. In fact, the Iowa-class battleships were probably the last wood-decked ships in the Navy. It was very common in World War II. Not at all common today. More often, modern ships just have fiberglass insulation in the overhead, and they put down non-skid on the deck. Well, what's non-skid? Well, this sandpaper-like sticker is a form of non-skid. And we see them going from passage to passage, so as you're stepping through a door, it's not slippery. They probably mop this a lot. On the main deck, it's a 2-part mixture. It's basically a sand additive called Black Beauty that you're dumping into whatever paint you're using on the deck. So you would paint your base coat gray, usually blue-gray, on the deck of a ship, and then you would go back and in your next coat you would heavily mix this sand grit, and that gives you the traction so you're not walking on slippery, bare steel. Battleship New Jersey doesn't really have any of that we know too much about during her service life. Maybe on the 05 level, the superstructure we did. As we paint the deck, we buy a adhesive, comes in little tubes that we mix in one tube per gallon of paint that gives just a little bit of grit to the surface. So it's not bare, smooth paint, but it's not the built-up ridges like you see on a Navy ship from the non-skid. The one place we likely had non-skid was back aft. The wood on the fantail was some of the worst deteriorated on the ship in the 80s, and the Navy didn't want to spend the money to completely replace it. They completely replaced the deck on Wisconsin, but they didn't spend the money for the other 3 Iowas. On each of the other Iowas, they did what was basically a Band-Aid. They put down, it's basically a rubber roofing compound, this rubber compound over the teak deck. And it was fine for getting the ship through the last couple of years of service, but it's not a long-term solution, and it's certainly not a solution that the museum can use to preserve the ship long-term. The rubber compound went right over the rotting wood, and it meant that any water that got under it was trapped there and just continued to rot the wood and waste the steel. Again, not an issue for the Navy since they're only using the ship for a couple more years. Huge issue for us. You can really easily identify the Iowa-class battleships in pictures from the 80s because they each had this rubber compound laid in different patterns. And to the casual observer, it looks like they've just ripped up the wood and it's bare steel. No, that gets rid of your insulation over the mess decks and the chief petty officer's quarters. Can't do that. So it is actually a rubber layer over the wood in a different pattern depending on the ship. And this also aided in loading shells and moving helicopters and boats around the deck so that you're not scuffing the wood underneath. The museum ripped all this up after getting the ship, and then the wood underneath was in such bad condition that it had to be ripped up because it was unsafe to walk on. And we are still in the middle of a $5 million, 5-year process to replace the teak wood. We're mostly finished the laying wood on the port side of the fantail, and we've ripped up all the wood and treated the metal underneath on the starboard side of the fantail. And we are hoping for a May 2023 completion date of this project. Your donations really help us out. Our volunteer deck force is out here Monday through Thursday tearing up decks so that our paid staff can lay new decking. Here's an example of the laminate that the Navy used in the 1980s. You can see the top doesn't look too bad where it's teak. But on the underside, the Douglas fir is thoroughly rotted. Here you can see where it's glued together and how the rot has taken the lower section. I'm here in our temporary carpenter shop with Jay Baker, the ship's carpenter, and Mike Shannon, the ship's painter. Mike will be treating the steel underneath of the wood and applying preservative coatings, and then Jay will be laying down the new decking.
Well, what then did a bosun mate do? What was his major duties?
Oh, a bosun's mate had a lot to do. As I said, it was painting, grinding the decks, a lot of mopping. Let's see, a lot of cleaning.
Later in the ship's career, possibly as early as the Korean War, but definitely during the Vietnam War, they started to lay tiling down on the decks. At that time, the tiling was 9 inches square and made out of asbestos primarily. Some of that tiling still exists in parts of the ships, old staterooms and storage areas, workshops. Those sorts of places never got swapped out. And the tiling and leveling compound underneath is fully intact. It was never swapped out because it was undamaged. And so it doesn't pose any sort of environmental hazard. The asbestos is encased. In the 1980s, they started to switch over to 12-inch linoleum tiles. With both the asbestos tiles and the linoleum tiles, you couldn't just lay them down on the steel deck. The steel is welded together. Oftentimes there was other equipment mounted there that was cut away, so it's not a flat, smooth surface. Before it's laid down, the linoleum is heated up so it's soft and will mesh to the surface. And if there's all sorts of peaks and valleys and scuff marks and impurities in the metal and whatnot, then you won't get a smooth, flat tile surface. So, prior to laying the tile, you have to put down leveling compound. In this ship, that leveling compound is mostly silica-based, and it's very similar to concrete. It's a sand mixture you get in a brown bag that you mix with water, and then you pour it, and it self-levels. Use a trowel to level it, and then you get a smooth surface that you can put your adhesive down on and then lay your tiles. The tiles, once it's been heated, cuts like butter with an X-Acto knife so that you can get the radius of the various pipes and other things you're laying the tile around. And it's a piece of cake. You've got a professional, smooth surface. The tile is then heavily waxed. Now your shipboard office looks like a regular office landside. The Navy doesn't operate ships to be used long term. Ships have a service life, 20 years, 50 years, something like that, a finite lifespan. Museum ships, on the other hand, we try to preserve them for as long as possible. And the tile is horrible for that. I absolutely hate the tile. Or, more precisely, the leveling compound underneath of it. The tile's not waterproof, so liquid that leaks into the space can get under the tile, particularly if a space floods and it's got sitting water in it. The leveling compound underneath, the concrete, is porous. It acts like a sponge. It holds water in it, and being underneath of the tile, it doesn't air out, so the water just stays there, pressed up against the steel. It eats away the coatings, and then it starts to eat away the steel itself. And in the process of going through this concrete-type silica-based leveling compound, it leaches some of the chemicals out of the leveling compound, and that accelerates the corrosion underneath. As the steel rusts, it blooms up, creating scale, which causes the tiles to then pop up. They've already been weakened by the water sitting on them, which delaminates their adhesive, so then you get places where the tiles literally bloom up out of the deck and have to be replaced. Every couple of years, the tiling manufacturers change their colors. So, we cannot match this probably 1982 blue tile. The blue now is just a little bit off. So we can't just patch, hey, this tile's popped up, let's patch this one area. We've got to replace the whole room, or else it looks like we just made bad patches. Modern Navy ships don't use tile extensively anymore. They use a poured terrazzo compound, which is like an epoxy, a two-part compound that you lay down like leveling compound, and it's pretty waterproof. Even by the late 80s, the Navy was starting to use it on this ship. So as tile was replaced, it was being replaced with the terrazzo compound. And there are a small number of spaces that have it on board Battleship New Jersey. Again, if moisture gets under it, usually through the edges, it'll start to rust bloom under it, and you just have to tear up the whole thing and then pour new compound. But it's less likely to have water leak under it and hold water. Before I continue talking about the tile, the fourth type of flooring we have on board the ship is a rubberized linoleum compound. It comes in sheets, and that tends to be used in spaces with electrical equipment, radio rooms, combat engagement center, combat information center, diesel generator spaces. Like those sorts of spaces tend to have this, it's just a sheet of rubberized linoleum that's laid right over the steel deck. And this way, that if your equipment sparks, it's not going to be transmitted through the steel. You've got a rubber base to prevent that. Now that we've talked about the different types of flooring, what does it mean? Depending on where you are on the ship, you might see different colored tile. That was intentional, believe it or not. Spaces used by officers tend to have blue tile, and that would exclude enlisted sailors from going through those spaces. The passageway we're in right now used to be used by warrant officers. Later, the spaces were, some of them turned into offices, and others are turned into admiral spaces in the late 80s, and so the blue tile remains. Enlisted spaces, which tend to be passageways and living spaces, berthing compartments, have tan tiling. There are other colored tiles on the ship as well. Medical spaces tend to have green tiles. Other workshops tend to have green or red or other colored tiles in them. Light lockers have black tile so that they don't reflect light. Light lockers are small compartments with exterior doors so that if the ship is under darkened ship conditions and you have to pass through that light locker, you're not going to have white light showing all the way to the horizon. If you want to see a light locker, check out this short video on changing a light bulb on the Battleship, which is about as detailed as this video on flooring. Look at how the P-way becomes black here. This is known as a light locker. And normally, there would have been a metal frame through here. I believe this is a remnant of the World War II outfit. And there may have even been a curtain or a joiner door so that the light in the P-way out there isn't going to be an issue when me as a crew member on this ship during nighttime sailing when we're supposed to be completely blacked out has to open a door to go out onto the weather deck to change watch or whatever the case may be. So in World War II, these light lockers were literal lockers with double doors or curtains or something. In the 1980s, they came up with a real cool feature, and this probably predates the 1980s, but by the 1980s it's installed on board. It's this thing up here. This is a darkened ship switch. Right now it's locked in place. It's got a pin in it that'll hold it back, and this door doesn't have one. The door has a little strike plate that sticks out of it that would hit this switch and force it open. And that leaves the light on. Then when you open the door, that strike plate is pulled away and this switch drops. There are probably other tiles that mean other things around the ship specifically that I'm not aware of. In some places, you can even cut this tile. Remember, when it heats up, you can easily cut it with an X-Acto knife and take another colored tile and inlay it to create designs in your space. This would probably not be done by shipyard workers when they're initially tiling it, but when the ship's company has to go back and retile, they often would mark it in some way. Now, we've talked about the tile and that it's a bad thing. Do we rip up all the tile on the ship? The long and short of it is no. On board some museum ships, ships that are interpreted in their World War II configuration, the tile gets ripped up and is left as bare steel, like it would have been during the war. And that's probably better for long-term preservation. On board us, when we rip up the tile, assuming we've corrected the leak, because there's no point in laying new tile if there's still a leak there, we then try to lay new tile in its place. Why do we do this if we know it's going to expedite the deterioration of the ship? Well, our mission is to preserve the ship looking as close as it did to its final configuration. So obviously they don't make the same sort of tile anymore. We can't get this exact color of blue, but the shade of blue that currently exists is close enough that we can redo this space and you still have the feeling of being in this space as it would have looked at the end of the ship's career. There's another type of flooring used on this ship. In some office spaces in particular, and berthing spaces, there is carpeting, particularly in the captain and executive officer spaces, and the admiral's cabin, of course. The carpeting is just to make the space feel more homey. It's, again, not great on a ship. It's easily worn out by boots, walking on it all the time. It's harder to clean than just mopping tile, and it holds moisture underneath. It's not really great for a marine environment. However, for these limited spaces, the captain, the admiral, the executive officer, it's small enough that you can swap that out, and they deserve some creature comforts given their status. It's also where the phrase being called to the carpet comes from. These people in charge of the ship often have to discipline sailors, and so when a sailor is not walking on tile or wood, they're walking on carpet, it's usually because they've done something wrong and they're about to get in trouble. So being called on the carpet is not a good thing, even if it might remind you of home. And while we're talking about the 9 and 12-inch tile, it's worth also mentioning that some of the bathrooms on the ship have a more traditional bathroom tile laid, and that bathrooms probably were even tiled during World War II, if not during the war for wartime expedience. Very quickly after the war, tiling was added. And so those are you can picture them from an old-timey bathroom, the smaller squares or hexagons or whatnot Those show up in a number of different colors and shapes and sizes throughout the ship, depending on how long it's been since it was laid. Wow, you guys just watched a 20-minute video on floor tile. You weren't even watching the wax dry, you were just watching me talk about it. Wow. What color tile was in your office space or berthing compartment? Or were you on a more modern ship with terrazzo? Let us know in the comment section down below. Do modern ships still have different colored terrazzo depending on the space? I'm not sure. Are you? Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, and also from a number of businesses and private individuals. Your support has allowed us to go from making one video a week to making multiple videos a week for more than a year now, and we really appreciate your continued support. There's a link in the description if you'd like to continue helping us. Also, remember to like, share, and subscribe so that you're notified when more videos come out. Thanks for watching.